recently released report on the Global Gender Gap Report. The highlight of the report: it will take another 118 years, or until 2133, when the global pay gap between men and women gets finally closed. What does it say about our efforts towards gender equality, and how do we as a country stand in this regard? For all that and more, I'm now joined by the author of that report, Saadia Zahidi, Head of Employment and Gender Initiatives at the World Economic Forum. Thank you so very much, Saadia, for joining us on The Big Picture tonight. Now, clearly, your report has created quite an uproar in terms of how we are as a society when it comes to addressing issues of gender inequality. It's interesting, your report comes in at a time when even McKinsey recently came out with a report which said that if the gender gap is closed, the overall global economy would gain by about $26 trillion. You know, the question that many are wondering is that gender equality is not just a moral or a social issue, but the fact is that if you do it, it also has a large economic impact. But do you think on policymakers, the economic implications of gender equality is largely lost today?
You're absolutely right. There is this economic incentive beyond the sort of social or justice perspective around gender equality. And that economic perspective plays out in many different ways. There are things like women's and girls' health and education that then has very strong multiplier effects for their families, for their communities, and then ultimately the economy. But then on the sort of the talent and the workforce side, that is where the case is the most compelling right now, because women now make up the majority of those that are graduating from universities in 100 countries around the world. And yet, when you look at what is happening in terms of their integration in entry-level positions, middle management, senior management, we're losing out on that talent. So there's a clear business imperative.
Saadia, your report importantly also highlights how issues of wage equality and labor force parity has in fact been stalling since 2009, 2010. So therefore, are you suggesting that since the global financial crisis, that gender equality has only worsened?
So I think there are two sort of mega trends that have had some impact, of course. One is, of course, the economic crisis and the slowdown in general in job creation, the disappearance of some forms of employment. Now, that has, of course, had an impact in terms of stalling the gender gap, keeping it where it is. But even more so, more recently, the effects of automation, the effects of digitization are actually replacing a lot of jobs that, yes, certainly on the manual labor side tend to employ a lot of men, but also sales and retail roles or administrative roles that employ a lot of women. So we're also seeing an erosion of jobs that have traditionally been held by women.
That's important, Saadia, because then essentially what you're saying is that the impact of automation and technology in terms of replacement of jobs is being primarily borne. This replacement is primarily being borne by the women.
They're certainly bearing the brunt of one side of it. I think we've seen already the impact of what is happening in manufacturing and maintenance and installation roles for men. But what we need to now watch out for is that next wave of automation is actually having a strong impact on women's roles and women's earnings.
Interestingly, Saadia, the report also says that the maximum progress has been made as far as political empowerment is concerned. In fact, you, of course, give statistics from various countries. But, logic would suggest then that, that powerful women leaders are perhaps far more sensitive to issues of gender equality, and they will try their best to address gender imbalance. Then why isn't it happening?
There are many different dynamics around gender equality, but one of the clear ones that has a lot of research behind it, it's when the non-dominant group, the minority group, first starts taking power, they actually have to behave like the dominant group has been behaving. And it's only after a critical mass of about 30% that the non-dominant group can actually behave as it wants to. And so if you take that theory and apply that to what has been happening in terms of gender equality, we need, one, to push for a much larger numbers of women that are going into politics for that critical mass to happen. But at the same time, we need to recognize that it's also the role of men to help create gender equality. It should not be a duty only for women leaders to pull up the next generation of women behind them.
Right. Standard economic theory, Saadia, that we've been taught right from the school level is that economic growth will automatically start addressing social ills. And in this case, gender equality and rather issues of gender inequality would automatically be addressed when a country reaches a certain level of economic growth. Is that, I mean, have we overstated that? Is that one of the key takeaways from your report?
So the narrative has been not just around that, but it's also been that once there is education, that gender equality will flow naturally. That is clearly not the case. Even though most countries around the world have closed or have almost closed their education gender gap, which is a reflection also of economic progress and development and growth, at the same time, that doesn't mean that those educated women are being integrated into the economy. It doesn't necessarily translate into women moving into leadership positions. So no, it is not a natural flow. It is in fact something that the governments that have done well on, they've actually put very clear policies in place to create the right kind of balance between family life and work life. And that is really what's made the difference.
Well said, Saadia. One final question from my side. Looking at more specifically from India's perspective. Of course, India's ranking as far as health and survival pillar is pretty dismal. In fact, anything that you've studied in your report from other countries from whom India can perhaps learn and improve its dismal performance as far as health and survival pillars are concerned?
There are actually two different Indias when it comes to the story on gender equality. There are the low-income, low-skilled women and low-income, low-skilled communities in which there is still a very strong gender bias. And one of the reasons that we see that health gap being amongst the widest in the world is still because of missing girls, sex-selective abortions. And then there's a second India where there are very large numbers of young women that are going to university, that are getting good skills, that are getting good certifications, that are going into the workplace, and that's where the really rapid change is taking place.
Well, let's leave it at that, Saadia. In fact, your report has created global ripples, and perhaps, hopefully, that public policies henceforth will be more attuned to addressing some of the issues that you have raised. Thank you so very much for joining us on The Big Picture at 10.